One of the darkest stories Nintendo has ever told is contained in a gorgeous Game Boy Advance game. In the jump to this handheld system, the legend of Samus Aran grew in depth and gameplay, generating a whole new legion of Metroid fans. Whether it was your first exposure to Metroid or you were a longtime fan, Metroid Fusion offers a little something for everyone. Metroid Fusion cuts right to the point, a straightforward action title that nonetheless contains the DNA of its more open-ended predecessors. It may be an easier game, but Metroid Fusion serves as an empowering introduction to what completing Metroid games feels like. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another brand new episode of The Completionist, where we don't just beat the games, we complete them. I've always loved the Metroid series. The ongoing tale of Samus Aran and her quest to eliminate the most dangerous threats in the galaxy is one of Nintendo's most mysterious and fascinating. Sci-fi action can be hard to pull off, but somehow Metroid makes deep space feel threatening and fun at the same time. Alex Fossiani and myself played through Metroid Fusion on my Let's Play channel Super Beard Brothers a long time ago, but this episode marks my first time actually completing the full game. Metroid Fusion is one of the most straightforward Metroid games ever made. It is also my personal least favorite in the mainline series that I've completed, but even though that statement sounds really harsh, Metroid Fusion is an incredibly fun time. As an introduction to this franchise, it's a perfect way in. Fusion is an excellent way to learn what makes the series interesting and satisfying to complete. It is a great snapshot of the strengths of the Game Boy Advance. It's not perfect, but Fusion succeeds because of the huge strides it makes, melding art direction and mechanics. Despite its linearity, Metroid Fusion gets my completionist rating of completed. And if you stick around, you'll understand why. Let's begin.
Yes! All glory goes to the winner! Game over! Wake up! Last one standing wins!
This video is brought to you in part by Nvidia, hashtag GeForce partner, hashtag ad, hashtag sponsored. One of my favorite things about games is learning something totally new. With some new amazing technology, Nvidia has managed to take ray tracing, a concept I thought I already knew and had opinions on well, and completely changed how I think about the process with the help of a little game called Cyberpunk 2077. Now, for what it's worth, I am not a Cyberpunk 2077 guy. Don't get me wrong, I love the Edge Runners anime that released last year, and the world that CD Projekt Red has built has always intrigued me, so I've been wanting to give the game another chance. This technology preview gave me one. With ray tracing overdrive mode, Nvidia has leveraged the power of futuristic technology to create something astounding. I'm not completely in the dark. Ray tracing, the technology that calculates light rays, has been around for several years now, but full ray tracing, aka what Nvidia is calling path tracing, is like seeing clearly for the first time. Ray tracing overdrive mode feels like a glimpse into what every graphically intensive game could look like in the future. Full ray tracing combined with Nvidia DLSS 3 demonstrated to me the most immersive version of Night City to date. Cyberpunk has always looked breathtaking if you had a beefy enough rig, but full ray tracing takes things to an entirely other level. When I updated my drivers and booted up Cyberpunk 2077 with full ray tracing on, it felt like my PC was doing something impossible. For a game that has always had good to great visuals, path tracing makes Cyberpunk look and feel like something bleeding edge. The cherry blossom market had me wandering around with my jaw on the floor. And this updated ray tracing makes Cyberpunk look even better in motion. I know it's kind of a cliche at this point to say that there is a pretty massive difference between Cyberpunk 2077 at launch and where it is today, but I gotta be frank here, I can honestly see what Nvidia is talking about. Full ray tracing makes lighting reflections and shadows look truly unbelievable. Light bounces and reflects realistically, and it makes the entire play experience feel new. Night City may be dangerous, but when it looks as good as it does here, I kind of want to see every neon drenched corner. Full ray tracing combined with DLSS3 is an entirely new way of rendering games. This tool allows for lighting effects I've never seen before. Full ray tracing makes every light source cast accurate shadows and reflections to a degree that I never thought was possible. Cyberpunk 2077 is an amazing test case for this new technology, and I can't wait to see what else Nvidia can push beyond its limits. Thanks again to Nvidia for sponsoring today's video and providing a true preview of the future of light rendering. Don't forget to check out the box down below to follow at Nvidia GeForce on their socials for updates about this incredible new technology.
Despite my love for it, I've always found the Metroid series to be somewhat frightening. The loneliness and isolation of Nintendo's sci-fi themed exploration titles is extremely well defined. Completing Metroid games can be a tense experience, but for me, it has always been a rewarding one. Overcoming fear and rising to meet a difficult challenge is what completing any given Metroid game is all about. Metroid Fusion is personally important for a few reasons. Even though Super Metroid is one of my all-time favorite games, I somehow never got around to Metroid Fusion, the direct sequel to that 16-bit classic. Until several years ago when Alex and I played it on Super Beard Brothers, I didn't know much about Metroid Fusion. As you all know, Metroid established a genre, the first half of the word Metroidvania. In any given Metroid game, except Federation Force, which we will not talk about, players control Samus Aran, bounty hunter and general badass. You explore an environment and blast enemies, expanding your arsenal of tools and weapons along the way, and use those found abilities to reach new areas. You progress, and then you rinse and repeat. Metroid stories take great inspiration from sci-fi horror classics like Alien, and has always been one of Nintendo's more tonally serious franchises. Whether in 2D or the 3D Prime series, playing these games at your own pace and slowly mastering them until you can speedrun them to the final boss is the key to completion. Metroid Fusion was released on the Game Boy Advance in 2002 after an 8-year 2D Metroid drought. This series has kind of always been Nintendo's black sheep, one that may have defined a genre but still only has 5 mainline entries in said genre, give or take a few remakes. Even though diehard fans love Samus and the games are generally well received, they remained incredibly underappreciated in my opinion. Come on, look at this game. How could you not fall in love with it at first sight? Metroid Fusion is gorgeous, featuring some of the best pixel art of its generation. Samus is beautifully animated, and the biological labs are teeming with life. Backgrounds convey information, the sound design is pitch perfect. The score is also really solid. Even though there are no tracks as memorable as Norfair from Super Metroid, Fusion has a fantastic soundtrack. It's honestly a shame that Metroid Fusion didn't even break the top 20 best-selling GBA games of all time. Not helping matters is that there is currently no way to easily access the entire series without having at least 3 generations of Nintendo consoles handy. 2021's Metroid Dread was a bona fide hit given the popularity of the Switch, and even propelled Metroid Fusion to the top of the Nintendo Wii U eShop. Fans have always kept the hype up for Metroid, even if Nintendo never pushed the series as hard as they could, and still haven't made the games all accessible as they should. It's currently not available on the Game Boy Advance Nintendo Switch Online app, but it has been announced and teased, which means soon we can play almost all of the 2D Metroid games that are out there on the Nintendo Switch. And with the recent release of Metroid Prime Remastered, it probably indicates that soon we'll get Metroid Prime 2, Metroid Prime 3, and eventually, when they're done, Metroid Prime 4. That said, the early 2000s were a special time to be a Metroid fan. We had the return of the 2D on the Game Boy Advance with Fusion, and the series' first foray into 3D with Metroid Prime. In 2004, we even had a top-to-bottom remake of the original Metroid on the Game Boy Advance with Zero Mission. But Fusion stands out because it made a few changes to the core formula. Gone was the hands-off, evocative approach to a 2D world in favor of a pretty on-rails experience that played to the strengths of a handheld console. To game director and lead writer Yoshio Sakamoto's credit, he understood that Metroid Fusion was likely going to introduce Samus and the Metroid saga to an entirely new audience. During development, he and his team had to consider what this meant from both a gameplay and storytelling perspective. For the first time, a Metroid game had a really in-depth opening cutscene, and Samus herself had an internal monologue that expressed to the player her thoughts, feelings, and fears. But the biggest change to the formula is the decision to spell out Samus's objectives at every turn. Instead of her finding her own path, Samus takes orders from a sentient AI of where to go next. This decision definitely upset some fans, and I can see why. Samus has always been an independent character who feels as though she's doing things her own way, and confining her to a pretty clear track feels more limiting at first. There is a lot more exposition in this game than you might expect. However, it is clear that the devs considered what putting a 2D Metroid game on a mobile console would feel like for the player. Sakamoto is quoted in a 2003 interview and said that one thing we had in the forefront of our minds during development was, how could we make Metroid easier to play? This is a game that is designed from the ground up to be played on the go. Now, I completed this game on the Wii U via the Virtual Console rather than a traditional GBA, but I could still appreciate Fusion's form. Series staples like the empowerment that comes from collecting every energy tank and missile, and the slow reveal of an expanding map make a return. And yes, all of your favorite power-ups like the Morph Ball, Super Missiles, and Screw Attack are back too, along with a couple of new tools like the Diffusion Missile. There are many small touches that play to the mobile-focused design. There are more save rooms in convenient areas, and instead of one large interconnected map, the station is segmented into different themed sectors. This makes the game much easier to pick up and put down, as there are clear stopping points and objectives built in. Sakamoto understood that for Metroid Fusion to succeed, his team had to overcome the intimidating expectations of old-school difficulty. He acknowledges that modern game balance and older game balance are two different things. Above all, we want modern audiences to understand our games and actually play them. I find that the design of Fusion is very player-friendly and completionist-friendly too, for that matter. Even though Fusion's narrative focus and linear design set it apart from previous Metroid games, completing it is very in line with all of them. This is still a game that requires multiple playthroughs to earn different endings, different splash screens, where Samus takes off her helmet and parts of her suit. Which ending you earn is based on how quickly you finish and what percentage of items you found along the way. There are 5 different ending screens to earn, and honestly, this is par for the course when it comes to Metroid games. Ending 1 is earned by finishing the game in over 4 hours with less than 100% of items collected. The second one can be seen by finishing the game between 2 and 4 hours without every item collected. The third ending is found by beating the game in under 2 hours without 100% of items found. The fourth ending requires you to find 100% of the items and finish the game in over 2 hours. And the final hurdle for the fifth ending is to finish the game under 2 hours with 100% of the items found. Here are all the different ways that I had to finish the game. 5 different end screens earned by a combination of different completion times, criteria, and items found. It sounds like a lot, right? But honestly, do not stress. For anyone who has never played a Metroid before, this all may sound impossible, but I have been honing my Metroid skills for literal decades at this point. In our Super Beard Bros playthrough, I managed to collect 100% of the items in about 6 hours of playtime, which is me playing the game blindly and never experiencing it before for that matter. But if you know the stats right there, in Metroid, that's an eternity. So doing the same thing in under 2 hours is honestly not that big of an ask if you're relatively skilled at these games and willing to practice. And recently, after mastering Metroid Dread, I went into the completion process of Metroid Fusion with nothing but confidence. I know I'm kind of an outlier when it comes to completing Metroid games, but for a series that used to scare me, like I actually found it so genuinely frightening as a kid that I could never bring myself to play the original, completing them now has been something that I greatly enjoy. Once you come to understand the structure of a Metroid game, completing them becomes one of the most empowering exercises you can engage in. Metroid Fusion is no exception, despite the changes in formula. At this point, completing a Metroid game is a ritual for me. I still complete the original Super Metroid, or at least a randomized version of it, several times a year, streaming on my Twitch page, twitch.tv/thecompletionist, or just for myself. And all that practice has paid off for my completion of this game. Metroid Fusion straddles the line between the perfect introductory Metroid game and a test for seasoned experts. One thing Fusion does extremely well is grant beginners the knowledge of what to do next. If you're new to the series, this is a very helpful crutch to rely on. Samus is forced to enter navigation rooms, cementing that this is indeed the most linear Metroid that I've ever played. Exploring feels constricted since the player must complete whatever objective is at hand before being able to move on to the next thing. But for me, I cannot be mad at this choice. It feels like onboarding for the entire series. At first, the game more or less tells you exactly what room you need to be in, but over time, it just points you to a general sector and just lets you loose. Veterans of the series might be disappointed that there isn't as much room for player expression and sequence breaking as other Metroid titles, but for completionists, there is still room to put a little of your own spin on things. Part of the legacy of Metroid Fusion has been the way the game recontextualizes Samus's backstory, mainly by adding a ton of it. This game has a lengthy introduction with tons of text to read through that gives Samus more lore than she's ever had before. Some found this a little controversial, but I'm on board. This game front loads a lot of info, but I think it's to the benefit of the player. The opening lays the stakes out clearly via cutscenes and static images. On what should have been a routine mission, Samus is attacked by the floating, gelatinous X-parasite. The parasite infests her entire body and central nervous system, and the only way she can survive is the surgical removal of her power suit and an injection of the Metroid DNA vaccine. To me, this is maybe the only good explanation for why a super powerful character like Samus has to reset her powers at the beginning of the game. In Fusion, the X-parasite is literally killing her, so scientists had to basically tear her down to build her up again. This entire process also accounts for a stylistic shift. Gone is big, bulky power suit armor in favor of a sleek blue and yellow design. But Sakamoto did not want to change Samus's design for the sake of it. He encouraged the art team to think of an in-game reason for a character redesign. Hence, the body horror of the X-parasite completely infecting Samus. It's a great narrative choice that feels cohesive with the rest of the game. Samus's body chemistry is different now that she has Metroid DNA, making her weak to cold environments. See, I love this story even if it's a little overexplained. The computer AI is definitely a little too chatty for my tastes, though this actually makes sense in the world of Metroid. Samus is taking orders from the AI as a condition of the scientists saving her life. I found there to be just enough motivation for Samus to progress forward, though some may find the revelations about her old boss, Adam Malkovich, unsatisfying. I personally think Samus is at her best when she answers to no one. Recompleting this game after Metroid Dread helped me appreciate the story swings that Fusion takes. The body horror elements of this universe are front and center, and never has Metroid lived up more fully to its alien-inspired roots. This game wants the player to feel scared and manages to do so even outside of cutscenes. The best example of this is the SA-X, Samus's power suit that's been zombified and is wreaking havoc everywhere. I love that Samus is confirmed to be the universe's most perfect killing machine, because even a copy of her is deadlier than anything else that was kept on the station. From the moment SA-X showed up with its creepy wide eyes, I was terrified of being shot in the back. Fusion leans into the sci-fi tropes of a space station being overrun by an experiment gone wrong. It is creepy and fascinating to enter an area and see X-parasites flow in from off-screen to transform into familiar monsters like space pirates. And even though there is an exposition dump seemingly every time Samus goes into an elevator, there is a lot of interesting environmental storytelling too. This research station is well and truly screwed, and we get to see it falling apart from Samus's point of view. Entering a new area and seeing how the SA-X has blown up doors or freed other life forms is awesome. Every sector is themed around a different biome, and they change as the game goes on. Areas initially feel isolated, but the player can eventually find ways to move from one area to another via secret tunnels and some elbow grease. This shows newcomers to the series that there is always more under the surface if you choose to poke at it. Building up a knowledge base of how to move through a Metroid game efficiently is a huge part of what makes these games fun. Fusion is no exception. Metroid asks a lot of completionists, but it always gives players the tools to do so. In Metroid Fusion, the eventual feeling of empowerment is as spot on as ever. There's a point in every Metroid game where you realize that you truly have embodied the spirit of Samus. As the player, finding all her abilities and maxing out her armory is as satisfying as it gets. Metroid Fusion places this feeling front and center. The closer the player gets towards completion, the greater the feeling of empowerment. As I trained to complete Fusion, I internalized the real meaning of knowledge is power. This is true for every Metroid game, but I appreciated how in this entry, it feels like Samus really has to climb uphill. From the start of the game, she is on her back foot against the X-parasite rampage, finding every ability, energy tank, and missile upgrade to finally strike back at the very end is an incredible arc. The fact that this game is able to disempower Samus, throw in a cool mystery, and then wrap up the story with her back at her peak in just a few hours is mind-blowing. I know I've done this a number of times, having completed 7 Metroid titles on this channel alone, but Metroid Fusion's story does a great job of setting the stakes extremely high from the jump, making overcoming those stakes and completing the game that much more satisfying. The actions I took to complete the game are largely the same as every other Metroid. I still had to carefully bomb every corner and map out every route. I had to memorize steps for future runs, so I was never flying blindly for long. Metroid Fusion encourages players to step into Samus's boots and become not just the most powerful weapon in the galaxy, but an elegant surgical tool as well. Because one awesome feature in Fusion is that every boss Samus faces is using an ability that belongs to her. The very first boss literally rolls into the morph ball, and by defeating the ex-parasite host, Samus gets her power back. Another boss fight against the melty-faced trash robot Nightmare finds Samus being repulsed by gravity beams until she defeats it and absorbs the gravity suit. This entire story is partially about Samus being broken down and building herself back up, not by upgrades on Chozo statues, but by wrenching her abilities back from the parasite who seeks to use them against her. It's inspiring to reclaim these abilities. It makes sense to do this. For 99% of Fusion's runtime, the station computer tells Samus she isn't powerful enough to overcome the SAX. And it's correct. Up until the very end, there is no point in turning and facing this doppelganger. But eventually, after some major twists that reveal the biological team was trying to breed Metroids in captivity, and that there are at least 10 SAX on board the space station, Samus steels herself to destroy the entire station and face SAX head-on. The battle against the SAX is fierce, but over quickly with a few well-timed charge blasts. But the fight does not end there. There's a classic Metroid countdown sequence, giving Samus only a few minutes to board her ship safely and escape the research laboratory. When she makes it to the docking bay, it seems all hope is lost as she encounters an Omega Metroid. Even with every ability up to that point, this boss seems unstoppable, and with one attack, brings Samus down to her knees. But in yet another twist, the SAX Samus defeated before comes back to sacrifice itself and grant Samus her final upgrades, her iconic orange suit, and with it, the power to wield the Ice Beam again. With this new infusion from the SAX, I defeated the Omega Metroid and escaped the space station with a crash full of critters. It's a very cinematic ending, and Samus feels more powerful than ever, having overcome the greatest threat she's ever faced. This story lands even more strongly since I just completed Dread recently. Seeing how Samus became the only one who can stand up against both the Scourge of the X and the unstoppable Metroid threat is a fulfilling narrative. Completing Fusion, I appreciated how the story really lays the groundwork for the events of Metroid Dread. Finishing the story is its own unique reward, but the real completion bonuses in a Metroid game are the unlockable ending screens. Mileage may vary on how satisfying you find this process. For me, if you're going to finish the game at all with 100% of items, you may as well complete it and earn every end screen. This game is short enough and linear enough that it empowers the player to achieve full completion. There is something very soul-affirming about completing a Metroid game. In Fusion, Samus goes from being the galaxy's ultimate bounty hunter to a shadow of her former self to being even more powerful than she's ever been up to that point. Completing this game is definitely easier than any other Metroid game. Even if you're new to the series, Nintendo's ever-present design philosophies shine brightly to get you over the finish line. Fusion's map is extremely helpful in pointing the player towards capacity upgrades. Screens with an upgrade defined are marked with a big circle, which changes once you find the upgrade. If you look carefully, you can see which rooms have alternate exits and intuit where to place a power bomb to melt through some walls. There aren't nearly as many opportunities to sequence break in Fusion, but I think that actually makes this a more completionist-friendly game. For example, you never really have to master the Shine Spark maneuver in Fusion to the same degree as you did in Dread. There are still some upgrades and secret walls to bust through using this technique, but it is no longer a make or break tactic. The linearity of Fusion means that you basically just have to memorize routes and then execute on them. If you're careful about where and when you save and gather your upgrades efficiently, you can hit that under 2-hour completion time with minutes to spare. I will say this though, earning all 5 endings is totally possible without doing 5 separate playthroughs. In fact, I only really did 4 for this video to save myself a little time. My first run was a leisurely for Metroid run where I took my time gathering every item and mentally mapped out where I needed to go. Playthrough 2 was when I needed to hone in on how to collect everything in under 4 hours. And playthrough 3 was where I executed that in under 2. In my under 2-hour 100% items found speedrun, I made sure to save at the latest possible moment before the final couple of battles. I then completed the game in about 1 hour 57 minutes and got my end screen, Samus rocking a blue 2-piece and showcasing her amazing abs. Then I reloaded the save and waited a few extra minutes, pushing my time over 2 hours with 100% of items found. Bam! That's another ending. Now this game does not keep track of end screens in a gallery like Metroid Dread does, so I say if you can see every end screen without 5 complete playthroughs, go for it. There are some features that I wasn't able to take advantage of this time around since I completed Fusion on the Wii U. The GBA to GameCube link and linking this game to Metroid Zero Mission. Linking Fusion to Metroid Prime with the GBA connector with the finished game save allows you to play the original Metroid and grants you the Fusion suit too. Linking Fusion to another GBA with Zero Mission lets the player see the Fusion endings in Zero Mission's gallery. But since these are more likely tied to other games entirely, I don't really count them towards completion for Metroid Fusion. Going back to the game, the sheer amount of abilities to find can be daunting, but it is impossible to miss finding any of Samus's major abilities. The 250 total missiles, 20 energy tanks, and 32 power bombs sound like a lot, but if you're vigilant and careful, you'll find them all no problem. Spending about a total of 14 hours on Metroid Fusion, not counting my 6-hour playthrough from a few years ago on Beard Bros, and earning all 5 endings is a point of pride, even if Fusion doesn't give you an easy way to view these screens after the fact. It feels incredible to finally have every mainline modern 2D Metroid game completed. The series will always be one of my favorites, and though it can be intimidating to try and earn those secret endings, doing so is as satisfying as one can imagine. Completing Metroid Fusion is not as high of a bar to clear as other 2D Metroid games, and doing so is the great first step in understanding why the process can feel so fulfilling. So, with that in mind, guys, I give this game my completionist rating of completed. Thank you so much for watching, and thanks to all of our patrons who got to see this episode early. In fact, for $5 a month, we have a whole bunch of fun perks throughout the year, so sound off if you saw this video on Patreon, and thanks for your continued support. You can join us over at patreon.com/completionist. Or, hey, if you want to see my first ever blind playthrough of Metroid Fusion on Super Mario Bros., there's a playlist on screen right now. You've got options. Thank you so much. We'll see you all soon. Bye.